Hi, my name's Dr. Padilla. I'm a professor in computer science and psychology, and I've been a professor for over 5 years now. Today, I wanted to talk about a topic that I truly love, and it's the power of saying no in your PhD journey. You will find that you will be asked to do so many things, and it's truly impossible to do them all. So you need to figure out a good way to say no, when to say no, and when to say yes to certain things. That can be really tricky if you don't know how to navigate these different social dynamics. So I'll give you my candid advice on someone who was formerly a people pleaser, but now is excellent at saying no. So let's jump on in. Okay, let's begin by talking about the PhD hustle and balancing the different requirements of you. When you get into a PhD program, there's no manual. There's really no set way that you have to do things. So you will find that you're going to be asked to do a ton of different things, some of which that are not useful for you to engage in. So how do you figure out what you actually want to prioritize? Now, I'm going to give you some general rules of thumb, but it might vary across different disciplines. The thing you need to think about is, what are you actually being evaluated on? And across all disciplines, I think there are some consistencies. You're being evaluated on the number of publications you have, how strong those publications are, the citations of those publications, and to some degree, teaching evaluations if you're a TA or an instructor of record. Okay, so those are almost all research-based or scholarly-based. I didn't say things like, are you a very good secretary for your lab or research group? Have you created excellent manuals? Are you always there baking food for the events? Are you showing up to every social event? None of those things you're being evaluated on, but you will be asked to participate in all of those things. So I'm here to tell you, you can say no to almost anything that is not one of the major things you're being evaluated on. Everything else is optional, and you can do them if you want, if they bring you joy, but they're not going to help your career. And we're in a situation where the world is going to be so much more competitive for academia, and you have a short period of time. I say this with a smile because when you're getting into a PhD program, 5-6 years sounds like a long time, but it goes by really quickly. And you'll see that some people end up wasting a lot of their time by doing stuff that they didn't need to because they didn't know how to say no. They were just taking on all these responsibilities. But this is your time. It's your educational time. And as soon as you're out of the university, you lose access to all these resources. So you have to take advantage of everything now. And that means not being distracted by stuff that is not going to serve your ultimate career goals, okay? So focus on exactly what you are being evaluated on for your particular career goals. Say yes to those things that serve that, and try to say no to the other things. So how do you actually say no? This is the tricky part. Now, I have been susceptible to saying yes for far too long. I cave immediately, and I really had to develop this really strong power. So I'm going to give you the advice that was given to me, and maybe some of these tips and tricks will work for you. The first one is to, rather than respond to the question, like maybe it's, can you organize this event? Or can you organize this application party or something, right? Some kind of major responsibility to organize. So you might be asked that type of thing. Instead of saying yes or no, you can turn it on the person who's asking, and it will almost always work out well for you. So when someone asks me, can you serve on this extra committee? I say, if you were my advisor, would you encourage me to take on this additional responsibility? So you're not saying yes or no, but you're flipping it on them. They want you to do it because it's some job that they need help with, right? And they just need bodies to do these things, and they probably don't care who does it. So if you switch it and have them think about, if they were your advisor, what would they ask you to do? They probably would say no, okay? Most of the time when I reframe that to people, if you were my advisor, if you were my mentor, would you suggest that I take on this responsibility? Most of the time people say, actually no, maybe this isn't the best time for you to do that. So they say no to themselves, which is genius, a little bit of inception going on there. Sometimes they say yes, and that actually can help you understand if, oh, maybe this is an important thing that would be useful for my career. So that can be informative too. But that is my very first tip and trick, is to switch the question around. My next super tip is to have a no committee. I was given this advice early on and I didn't do it because it feels weird, but someone suggested that I find someone who's a little bit more senior in my field and ask them to be on my no committee. And what that means is when I'm asked to do something new, I send the request to that person and say, should I do this? And they almost always write back no. Just no, one word, because you usually shouldn't be doing whatever it is they're asking you to do. What that allows you to do is to get a little feedback, first of all, and then the way that you would say no in response is saying, I spoke with my mentor and they suggested that this isn't a good time for me to take on this responsibility. So you are not saying no, you're telling them that your mentor has said no. And they always take that and they're understanding of that. Now, when I tell people about this, they love the idea, but they often have a hard time finding a person to be on their no committee. Secret tip, you don't actually need a no committee. You could respond and say, my mentor indicated that this is not the best time for me to take on this additional responsibility. Your mentor didn't have to say that. No one's fact checking. It's just a really easy way to say no without having to say no yourself. So pro tip, if you don't want to have a no committee, you can still say that your mentor said that it is not the best time for you to take on that additional role. Now, when I do just need to say no outrightly, my go-to, just to make sure that I'm not burning any bridges or doing something uncomfortable, is to indicate why I'm saying no. So I usually say, sorry, I'm completely overloaded at this time, and that's usually true. And you can list out the responsibilities that you have, indicating that it's not as if you don't want to help, but you've already committed to other things, which is 100% the truth. In any case, the way I structure those emails is I say, thank you for considering me. Thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate you, thinking of me. Unfortunately, I've overcommitted myself at this time. If you know of anyone else that might be a good fit, you might recommend someone asking that person. But yeah, I just have a very simple, straightforward email, 3 lines, thanking them, describing that you're overcommitted, and either recommending them to think of someone else or say, please consider me for future opportunities, that type of thing. The last way I see people say no that I do less of, but it's very frequent, is with emails. That's when they just don't say anything at all and they assume that the other person will know that it is in fact a no. Now, I think that happens more and more the more senior you become in a field, because you're just getting bombarded by things. You might have 20 emails from students asking you for research opportunities and 3 or 4 emails a day asking you about other stuff. And the only thing you can do is just not respond if it's a no, and you only respond to the yeses. I think that can be successful for some people. I struggle a little bit with that because sometimes I'm asking people for things that I need to know if it is a no. So I would say use that with caution. It can be very frustrating if someone gets no response. I certainly have to do it, unfortunately, in some situations when I'm just bombarded by emails, but definitely a lot of people use that technique. So if you are not getting a response, especially after a follow-up email, consider that a no. And I think a lot of people use that particular technique. Now, I think the hardest time to say no is face-to-face. And this one I have had to learn and I'm still working on. But this is a situation where someone is chatting with you and they just ask you, like, hey, can you do this? Can you take on this role? Can you do X or Y, right? And that is so scary because it's a interpersonal relationship, it's a social dynamic, and you want to say yes, you want them to be happy, but you probably shouldn't do that thing. So what I've learned works for me, this might not work for you, is to stall. This is, okay, let me think about it. I'll think about it. I'll think about it and get back to you. And then you can use all the previous strategies that I mentioned earlier on in this video. But I find I have never been able to say no to someone to their face. Just say like, no, I'm not going to do that at this time. I can't do that. Maybe you can. But if it's a no, then I'll have to stall. And when they follow up, I'll explain that I can't do it. So maybe you're brave enough to say no. I'm not brave enough one-on-one. The last thing I'll say is when you're in an interpersonal one-on-one setting or in a group setting, what can happen is there's volunteers that are needed. So there'll be something like, we need volunteers for X and Y, and there is a long, uncomfortable silence. If you don't really want to do it, do not volunteer. Do not get peer pressured into saying yes by just the uncomfortable silence. It might go on for a long time, but then it'll be over. If you can handle a minute of silence, you might save yourself dozens of hours in whatever you're volunteering for. So try to build up some resilience to that uncomfortable silence and not necessarily be the one who volunteers simply because no one's volunteering and you're uncomfortable. Now, after saying all of that, there are times that you should say yes. And that can be tricky to figure out when is a good time to say yes and how to actually do that. So I think what you want to figure out is when what you're being asked to can have indirect effects on what you're being evaluated on, okay? So maybe it's you want to get a good letter of recommendation from your PhD advisor, and they are asking you to do certain things. I think prioritizing their asks over other people's asks makes sense, even if it's something you know you shouldn't be doing. I think prioritizing them because they have a vested stake in your career and they're going to have some practical thing they will give you in the end, like a letter of recommendation. You're not necessarily going to ask for letters of recommendation for all the other faculty in your department, maybe 2 others, okay? So prioritize a few others. But if it's just some random department ask of your time, you might not necessarily need to do that type of thing. Other cases where you should consider saying yes is when there is documentation of the distribution of work, okay? So an example of this is you might be asked to review a paper, okay? The way that it works in academia is you submit a scholarly paper and then 3, sometimes 4 people have to review your paper, okay? So that means for every 1 paper you submit, you should review 3 papers to kind of replenish the system because it's all volunteer. And it's tracked. For each journal, they have data about who is doing reviews and how many. So if you agree to do one of those reviews for a journal that you submit to, it is kind of logged and you're seen as a good community member, okay? If it is a journal that you do not submit to and you never plan submitting to, you don't need a review for those folks because it isn't like you're replenishing the system, you're not doing a solid for people in your community. You can certainly do those reviews, but you want to prioritize the community that you're going to be going into, and especially if you are taking resources, you want to try to replenish those resources. And the last thing I want to say about when to say yes is trying to be reasonable. I see in academia, a lot of times there's many big personalities and they've gotten so good at saying no. And it can often lead to a situation where people have unreasonable asks and then we just become at a standstill. For example, I might be scheduling a meeting and there's multiple people who need to be involved, and one person can only meet on Wednesdays and the other person can only meet on Mondays. And that's their hard no, right? Because their rest of their time is sacred. So they've learned to say no and just only meet on these days. So that just means we don't meet, right? I literally cannot change time to make it work where these 2 people can meet together. So that is a little ridiculous. Maybe a little bit more flexibility in the schedule would be ideal, or maybe they just don't want to meet. That's the case where they should say, you know, I recognize that I'm overcommitted at this time, so I don't need to be involved in these meetings, rather than making this kind of incommiserate ask of trying to find a way to solve this equation. I think also within that, being kind of reasonable, is understanding a hierarchy of time constraints. As a PhD student, believe it or not, you're gonna have more time than the postdocs in the lab, and the postdocs will have more time than the teaching faculty, and the teaching faculty will have more time than the tenured professors, and so on all the way up, okay? So if you can be flexible in a sensible way, allowing for the more constrained timeframes of those people up the food chain than you, that looks really good. And that is recognizing that at some point you're going to be in one of those positions where you truly have a more limited time, and you will expect individuals that have more flexibility in time to be able to accommodate those things. So those are my tips for saying no in your PhD journey. And I just want to close with saying that expressing no is a way of showing self-love, showing care for your needs and your desires, and even just freeing up time for mental health, for activities that you love, ensuring that you can have a sustainable career that is fun and enjoyable. You don't have to pack it in with all this nonsense that everyone wants you to do. So every time you say no, you're giving future you a little gift, a gift of more time. And time, I think, is the most valuable thing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe for more content on academic success. Take care.